But first, this morning, our panel on equality, liberty, and risk. I want to give a special acknowledgement to our moderator, who I'll thank in advance, Judge Barrington Parker. Judge Parker was elevated to the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit in November 2001, which, as I recall, is just on the heels of 9/11, so that must have been quite an event. And this happened after having served on the Southern District of New York for about 7 or 8 years. Prior to that, he was a litigator, commercial litigator, for over 20 years. I add all that up, and I say you're looking good. I don't. So how many? How you fit all those years of career into that? But and this all after having been educated at Yale College and Yale Law School. But most importantly, for my purposes, he's been a great friend of the Federalist Society and a fairly constant presence at our National Lawyers Convention. So, Judge, thank you very much for being here today and for being here in the past, and I'll turn things over to you.
Good morning, and thank you very much, and a particular thanks to you, Dean, for making this happen, for inviting us here, and for the terrific programs that you and your staff have put together. I'm sure everyone here joins me in those words of thanks. You've done yet again a fabulous job on the national meeting. We have a terrific panel today, and I will just briefly introduce the panelists. I'm sure most of them, if not all of them, are known to you either personally or by reputation. We will follow the customary format of these sessions. Each panelist will speak for 8 to 10 minutes. We'll allow a brief time for exchanges among the panelists, and then, of course, you are all invited to take your place in the queue at the microphones and to liven the discussion with questions that you may have to the panelists. On the dais, from my right, Boyden Gray. Boyden Gray served as ambassador to the European Union from 2006 to 2007. Before that, he was White House counsel in the administration of George H.W. Bush. He's had a long and distinguished career at the bar with a number of very prominent firms here in town. He has, about a year ago, entered a new and exciting phase of his life. He started the firm Gray and Schmitz, and he went from 1,000 colleagues to a handful. But he's excited about that transition. We're very, very happy to have him with us today. Carl Bogus. Carl is a professor at the Roger Williams University School of Law in Bristol, Rhode Island. He is visiting at Drexel. He's a graduate of Syracuse and its law school. He was in private practice for more than 20 years. He is widely published, widely read, in a wide variety of subjects that will be pertinent to this morning's panel. He's written in the tort reform, products liability, gun control, Second Amendment, to name just a few. I have the more extensive version of his biography, and I can't. It's hard to imagine how he finds time to do the articles and books that he has generated over the course of a long and distinguished career. To my left, Frank Easterbrook. Frank has served with great distinction for more than 25 years on the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. Prior to that, he served, again with great distinction, on the faculty of the University of Chicago, where he was the Lee Freeman Professor of Law. He taught in the areas of antitrust, securities law, jurisprudence, criminal procedure, to name just a few. The teaching followed distinguished service to the profession and to the country in a number of other areas. He was the Deputy Solicitor General for a number of years. He's graduated with distinction from Swarthmore and from the University of Chicago Law School. He is well known to this organization and well known throughout the bench and the bar. Christine Jolls. Christine is the Tweedy Professor of Law at the Yale Law School. I was about to say that she was a rising star at the Yale Law School, but that's not accurate. She's a risen star at Yale Law School. She came in 2006 and has been a stellar addition to that school's faculty. I hear from many sources, her students, her colleagues, the administrators, how delighted they are to have her at the Yale Law School. Prior to coming to Yale, she taught for 10 years at Harvard Law School. She is from the West Coast. She went to Stanford and Harvard Law School. She has a PhD in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She clerked on the D.C. Circuit for Judge Williams, and then she was law clerk to Judge Scalia on the Supreme Court. She writes and teaches in the areas of employment law, privacy law, behavioral economics, and government administration, and she has also served with distinction in various capacities with the federal government. That completes the introduction. We will hear from Boyden.
Thank you very much. I'm a little intimidated with all these academics here, but I hope I'll survive. But any understanding of this topic in the context of our commercial society under our Constitution has, in my opinion, to include a review of Adam Smith, or start with a review of Adam Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment, where many of the ideas that pervade our Constitution and our related U.S. economic model were developed. 1776 was a good year, not just because of what happened here, but also because of the publication of Wealth of Nations and the death of Hume, the great Scottish philosopher and Smith mentor, whose ideas were well known by the founders. The work of Adam Smith is as relevant today as it was in 1776, especially in light of recent events. His great insights included anchoring the theory of free markets in human nature and explaining them by use of examples from the American colonies, not, I emphasize, from his own continent or his own Europe. It is difficult, therefore, to understand the concepts of equality, liberty, and risk under our Constitution without some understanding of Smith. Now, contrary to popular belief, not to belief in this room, but to the public's understanding, Adam Smith was by training at first a moralist, not an economist. And his theory of moral sentiments he thought was more important than Wealth of Nations, as P.J. O'Rourke has observed and has observed the most recent biographer of Smith, a man named Nicholas Phillipson, whose book, a recent book on Smith, I would encourage you all to read. The question Smith addressed in his first book was how human beings develop moral sensibility, as he rejected the then prevailing notions that morality was either innate or religiously based. He found his answer in his psychological insights into the workings of human imagination, fellow feeling, and sympathy, terms which then meant trying to understand ourselves and how others might understand us. What he concluded was that as man persisted in trying to improve his own economic condition, he had to learn to cooperate, to use a very modern term, with his potential counterparties in order to expand his and their opportunity. Oversimplified, Smith internalized, recognized the need to internalize the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or, as we think of it today, what goes around comes around. The bigger the marketplace for cooperation, the bigger the opportunity for self-improvement and the need to develop traits of prudence, self-discipline, and moral behavior. Thus, engagement in free markets enabled self-improvement and at the same time refined the moral sentiments that made markets work even better. The result was an almost revolutionary focus on individual freedom where, quote, and that's why I'm reading here because I want to get the quotes right, where, quote, the obvious and simple system of natural liberty establishes itself of its own accord, close quote. Smith continued that in such a system, quote, every man, as long as he does not violate the laws of justice, is left perfectly free to pursue his own interest in his own way, close quote, as a process by which, quote, the sovereign is completely discharged from a duty of superintending the industry of private people, close quote. What a glorious concept. And the need for private individuals to work cooperatively with others to allow expanding commerce to flourish would, in a civilizing way, produce the prudent and virtuous citizenship essential to an ordered society. Now, critical to his vision was an elimination of all artificial, as he called it, systems, quote, systems of preference or restraint that interfered with free men pursuing their own interests. What he feared was government-supported monopolies of merchants or suppliers of money capable of seeding credit bubbles of the kind we have recently experienced. Exploitation of government power by businessmen for private gain, we call it rent-seeking or agency capture or crony capitalism, was perhaps his worst nightmare. If he were alive today to see the interwoven aspects of the government-supported and financed subprime mortgage securitization on Wall Street, he might repeat his observation, my favorite, that, quote, the government of an exclusive company of merchants is perhaps the worst of all governments for any country whatsoever. One of his other quotes that I love is, no two businessmen can get together for any period of time in private without conspiring against the public interest. He didn't much like the Edinburgh businessmen that he had to associate with when he was in Scotland. The Enlightenment's first contribution to our Constitution was, therefore, to support the concept of separation of powers with its emphasis on self-improvement, that is, the Enlightenment's emphasis, setting, quote, ambition against ambition, close quote, to use the Federalist phrase, to match Smith's vision that liberty would allow every man, quote, to bring his industry and capital into competition with those of any other man or order of men, close quote. But Smith's second contribution to support the creation of an internal market free of the constraints of monopolies and other preferences supported by state interference was just as important, if not the flip side of the same thing. It is therefore perhaps appropriate that the great British historian Paul Johnson would remark that Chief Justice Marshall's constitutional rulings on commerce that established the basis for entrepreneurial capitalism to flourish in an unfettered internal market were, in Johnson's words, unrivaled in the entire history of jurisprudence. The Enlightenment figures understood that giving citizens liberty to improve themselves, subject always to the rule of law, would likely result in inequality of result. But they felt it was better to be a poor man in a rich economy than a rich man in a poor one. And equal opportunity would always prevail if competition were not crushed by government support for merchant monopolies and preferences in an effort to eliminate the risks for favored insiders. Eliminating government preferences and protections in favor of private competition would also produce the most virtuous and prudent body politic. Smith would probably be appalled, but certainly not surprised by what he would see today if he were alive. He and his colleagues gave great advice to the founders about the dangers of big government and crony capitalism and the benefits of liberty and competitive markets, based critically, I repeat, on the experience of the American colonies, not Europe, as pointed out by Phillipson. Smith's advice is still good today. Now you might ask, what would that advice be? Well, he would certainly have condemned, and if he were in a position to stop it, have stopped the government intervention in the mortgage markets. As Peter Wallison pointed out yesterday, 75% of these bad mortgages were encouraged, financed by the federal government. The fact of the matter is that in ordinary commerce, a mortgage broker in a decent-sized town is not going to sell a mortgage to a customer who couldn't pay it back, especially if he was going to have to run into that customer, or he or she was going to have to run into that customer at the PTA or church or the local Chamber of Commerce. But if the government's going to come in and buy out the mortgage broker says, well, what the heck? And that's what Smith would have said, hey, don't mess with the operation of private morality that would at some point say what goes around comes around. You see, the government doesn't have to worry about that, at least up to a point. I think that he would have also said the Fed financed the bubble in ways that sort of like the South Sea bubble. I mean, he was familiar with all of this, and I think he would have said about the Fed, you're printing too much money, as many people were saying here. Finally, I think in terms of the future, he would say, don't perpetuate this mating of government and private industry. The financial reform bill, he would probably look at and say, God, what an opportunity for agency capture. You know, he wasn't familiar with public choice theory, but that's what he would have said. This is going to get captured by the big banks to the detriment of the little guys, and don't do it. Don't go that way. It's going to perpetuate too big to fail. And he would have pointed to the article in the New York Times, which I mentioned yesterday, where the statement was, government goes to Wall Street doesn't go to the government. The government went and met the Wall Street moguls at The Nest, a private hideaway in the Willard Hotel. And if Smith had known about that, he would have said, see, there you go, cut it out. Thank you.
Well, just so it's not a shock to your system in a moment or so, let me give you a fair warning. I'm one of the liberals that the Federalist Society invites to appear on its programs now and then. And but I consider myself a Burkean liberal. I happen to be a great admirer of Burke. If you think that that term is an oxymoron, liberal Burkean, you can see me after the program. But I do want to start with a quote by Burke. And Burke did not like abstractions, and he did not like ethereal kind of thinking. He liked to deal in specifics, and he said, abstract liberty, like other abstractions, is not to be found. Liberty adheres in some sensible object, and every nation has formed to itself some favorite point by which way of eminence becomes the criterion of happiness. And he said that, and he was speaking in 1774, he said, even as of that time, in England and in America, the focus about liberty was on taxes. The more taxes, the less liberty. And why is that? So maybe the pithiest description of that was given by Hayek, who said individuals should be allowed within defined limits to follow their own values and preferences rather than somebody else's. And capitalism provided freedom because it allowed individuals to do just that. And he said, if we strive, quote, if we strive for money, it is because it offers us the widest choice of enjoying the fruits of our efforts. So liberty has many meanings, and I'm not saying this is the only aspect of liberty, not by any means, not by any means, but one aspect of liberty is for us to be able to use the fruits of our labors to expend them on what we wish to expend them for. And to the extent that that is constrained, whether it's by taxes or by circumstances, and that's constricted, there is a constriction of liberty. So I'm going to, in Burkean fashion, try to talk about this in a specific context. Now, the specific context I've chosen is healthcare, but I'm not an expert in healthcare, and I'm not talking about healthcare, although I'm using it as an example. I'm talking about liberty. But we all in this room pay for health care. We pay for health care for others through taxes, the Medicare system, the Medicaid system, the Veterans Administration system, and we pay for health care for ourselves and for our families, mostly through private insurance systems. But it's not something we really have an election about. We're all, in this room, responsible individuals. We know we have to have health insurance to cover ourselves and cover our families. And the more that we spend for that, the less we have available to spend for other things. And I'll be putting the combination here, the kind of the compulsion by, some of it's by government, some of it's by circumstance, but it's a combined compulsion. So here's the deal. 50 years ago in the United States, speaking of liberty on a macro level, 50 years ago in the United States, 5% of the U.S. gross domestic product went to the healthcare system, 5%. Today, it's somewhere between, I've seen different figures, somewhere between 16.5% of the GDP and 19%. And the Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2082, if current trends continue unabated, it'll be 50%. Fully half of the entire gross domestic product will be devoted to health care, and liberty on a macro level constrained proportionately. Now, I'm going to ask you to follow with me for a second a simple thought experiment. Let's say that we change the American healthcare system. Not a socialist system, not a socialist system in my thought experiment. All doctors are going to be in private practice, or almost all doctors will be in private practice, no more employed by government under my thought experiment than currently employed by government. Most hospitals will be private. They will all compete robustly. There will be a lot of insurance plans, and they'll all be private, but they will be heavily regulated by the government. And there'll be some constraints. Among the constraints, they will all be nonprofit. And in my thought experiment, among the constraints are they will not be able to deselect the people they cover. They're going to have to cover anybody who wants to buy their insurance. They will spend practically no money evaluating claims, because they will be required to pay all claims submitted by doctors and hospitals and clinics promptly, without if they get a bill, they'll have to pay it. And as a result, under my thought experiment, instead of 20% of all premiums going for administrative costs, it'll be 5%. By the way, that's what it is in the United States today. 20% of all premiums go to cover administrative expenses. They will not advertise, and that'll be another reason they'll be able to reduce their administrative expenses to 5%. There will also be other efficiencies in the system. Every patient in the country will carry a vital card. And that card will have on it their entire health record. And they'll be able to go to any doctor in the country. There'll be no in-network and out-of-network. They'll be able to select any doctor in the country, any hospital or any clinic. They'll give them their card. That card will have their entire health record on it, their lab tests, their x-rays. That doctor will be able to pull it up on his computer. He'll be able to see all of the records. He'll be able to type in whatever notes he has, and that patient will carry that card with him. And that will also reduce expenses. There will, under my system, be more doctors per capita in the United States than there are now, and more hospital beds per capita, and actually, people will be consuming more health care than they currently consume. Doctors will even make house calls. Under my system, my thought experiment, let's say per capita costs for health care decline because of the savings that I've mentioned, from $7,000 per capita, which is what the United States currently pays per annum, per capita, to $3,000. And instead of spending somewhere between 16.5% and 19% on GDP, we'll be spending 11%. That'll still be a very expensive system. Still be a very expensive system. But it'll be at least 5.5% less of GDP than it currently is. And on a macro level, that is a lot of liberty. We will be saving a lot of liberty. Now, what's the output going to be? What's the quality? My thought experiment assumed the following. By all objective measures, healthcare will be more effective. Infant mortality will decline from its current rate in the United States of 6.37 deaths per 1,000 births to 3.41. Under the World Health Organization's system of rating the overall performance of 191 national healthcare systems, we will move up from 37th, where we are now, behind Greece, Chile, Costa Rica, to number 1. The Commonwealth Fund, which ranks 19 of the health systems in the wealthiest nations, we will move up from near the bottom, number 15, to number 1. And the percent of citizens who say that they are fairly or very satisfied with the healthcare system will rise from the current rate in the United States, 40%, to 65%. Now, everything comes with a price. And let me be frank about the price. Doctors are going to make less, considerably less. In fact, maybe about a third about what they currently make. And that's a constraint on liberty. I concede it. It's a major problem to think about. Now, the system I've described, as you've all suspected, is a real system. It happens to be France's. Happens to be the French system. I'm not recommending the French system. I didn't select it because it's the best. I don't know what the best is. I could have picked any major country. The United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, Japan, Taiwan. And that system would be paying less for health care and probably having better outputs by every measure. So, this brings me back to liberty. This brings me back to liberty. What's my point? My key point is this. You know, we tend to demagogue these issues, and we tend not to think clearly about them. Even the description of the program. Are we drifting to Euro-socialism? My suggestion is that we need to talk together in a Burkean way with more specifics about this. What do we mean by liberty? How are we going to maximize it? And think about very complicated questions like the healthcare system this way. Now, I'm going to end with one last quote. One last quote. Quote, Where, as in the case of sickness and accident, neither desire to avoid such calamities nor the efforts to overcome their consequences are, as a rule, weakened by the provision of assistance. Where, in short, we deal with genuinely insurable risks, the case for the states helping to organize a comprehensive system of social insurance is very strong. I'm skipping a couple of sentences. There is no incompatibility in principle between the states providing greater security in this way and the preservation of individual freedom. Now, who would a good liberal quote at a Federalist Society meeting for that proposition? Road to Serfdom, Hayek. Thank you.
Well, what's the right relation among liberty, equality, and risk? My approach starts with John Stuart Mill. You allow liberty to do as you wish, provided that you do no harm to others. That approach facilitates transactions and supports the Pareto principle, an attractive definition of welfare that increases when each transaction makes one person better off and no one worse off. Now, you have to understand, I am not dissing the Scottish Enlightenment. I'm not disagreeing with Boyden Gray. Those of you who have looked at this is not a James Madison tie. This is an Adam Smith tie. I tried to get a John Stuart Mill tie for today, but couldn't find one. Smith, Mill, and Pareto all stress freedom of choice. If the state blocks risky acts on the assumption that it knows better, we deny individual freedom and frustrate Pareto improvements. Now, in the main, our society allows people to make very risky choices. You can choose what education to get, how much education to get, and where to get it from. You can choose a job. You can choose a spouse, or the lack of one. You can choose children, or the lack of children. You can choose where to live. You can choose what sports to engage in. You know, people die when swimming or skiing. You can choose how much to exercise. People die when they don't exercise enough, and they die when they exercise too much. You can choose what and how much to eat. You can choose your investments, including the right to put all your eggs in one basket, despite the fact that every financial economist in the world knows that there are big gains from diversifying. In a world where those kinds of risks are thought appropriate and absolutely essential to freedom, I find it very odd that the government sets out to regulate smaller transactions, such as, credit card debt. Now, what are the necessary conditions for Mill's and Pareto's approach to work? Well, the government needs to enforce contracts, needs to prohibit force and fraud, it needs to allow insurance. I mean, insurance is voluntary risk control. People choose for themselves how much and what kind of risk to take, and then they can choose a combination, a risk-return combination, through their choice of insurance. And it seems to me unwise to interfere with any of those things, because the more you interfere with any of those, the less choice people have to choose their risk-return combination. What other things can government do consistent with Mill's general approach to the choice, to the trade-off between freedom and regulation? Well, disclosure is one common strategy, but it's a strategy that has some limitations, and I'd like to give you 3 examples. Let me start with stocks. The Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 require issuers of securities to make a good deal of disclosure. And that kind of disclosure by the issuer cuts down the costs of multiple investigations. The issuer knows a lot more about itself than any outsider does, and the disclosure avoids the need for multiple sequential redundant investigations. But useful disclosure about investments turns out to be very complex. much too complex for any normal person like me or like you to make any use of. What makes that kind of disclosure work is liquid markets. Sophisticated traders trade with each other. They get the information, they trade with each other, and they finally reach a price at which sophisticated people are on both sides of the transaction, and the price reflects what that information is. And the rest of us benefit from it without ever having to read a securities prospectus. But liquid markets are limited. If you think about my list of very risky acts, there are no liquid markets for jobs, spouses, indeed even for personal credit. When Congress enacted the Securities Acts of 33 and 34, it largely rejected merit regulation. That is, some states had adopted securities regulation that said, stock X is just too risky, it can't be sold. Or sometimes, it would just be too high a price to sell this stock for that price. And that form of merit regulation made it very difficult for new firms to raise capital. The result of merit regulation was unhappy, and the national choice was not to have it. And the result of this system, in which there is disclosure, liquid markets, but no merit regulation, has been extraordinary prosperity in the United States. Yet many recent laws, and I have as examples the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and the Dodd-Frank law, have substantive controls on how firms must be organized or behave. And certainly from the perspective of Mill or Pareto, reducing the number of legal options will make everyone worse off. My second example is the Real Estate Settlement Practices Act. Now, this requires certain disclosures for people who buy or finance a house. Very hard to see how anybody could oppose a really plain statement of interest and closing fees. And that's how the Real Estate Settlement Practices Act began. It began as part of the plain language movement. And it was hijacked, as is perfectly normal for systems of that kind, normal and expected. Any of you buy a house lately? I bought a house 3 years ago. And when I did, the disclosures required by the Real Estate Settlement Practices Act exceeded 100 pages. None of it was plain. Much of it was in all capitals, which no human being can read. Well, I have a life to live, so I didn't read one word of it. What we now have is a high-cost system that produces a minuscule, if any, gain. Now, let me now give you a third kind of disclosure. Think of the personal credit market. You need a loan of some kind, or you sign up for a credit card. Now, it's easy to see gains in principle from more competition in the rate of interest. Firms will compete, that'll drive down the rate of interest, we'll all gain from it. And that leads to the idea that everybody should be required to state an annual percentage rate, which is defined by a federal statute about how you compute it, and then people can compare one rate to another. It sounds fine so far. It sounds like a market-promoting device. But the Fair Credit Reporting Act turns out not to stop there. There are lots of mandatory disclosures that complicate forms. In fact, the forms became so complicated, not as complicated as the Real Estate Settlement Practices Act. They became so complicated that the federal law was changed to require a simplified box summarizing the parts of the supposedly simplified form. But of course, as soon as you do that, you then have to stop people from disclosing other things, because that would be distracting. So a lot of disclosure turns out to be forbidden. And if you're going to require simplified disclosure, what does a simplified disclosure look like? The federal regulations cover such things as typeface, which things have to be on page 1, which things have to be on page 2. We see litigation these days over things of the sort that says, well, this warning should have been on page 2. It was instead on page 1. Therefore, all of the people who had credit cards from issuer X are entitled to $100. Who pays? Well, of course, the borrowers do. There's no such thing as a free lunch. In competition, these costs are all going to be borne by the borrowers in higher interest rates. So I think you can see with some of these examples how even apparently straightforward, assertedly transaction promoting legislation can easily go astray. And of course, this too has been hijacked. Last year, Congress added substantive regulation, such as a mandatory 45-day wait to change the interest rate of borrowers. It used to be that a borrower and a creditor could contract that if the borrower did bad things like miss payments, the creditor could raise the interest rate to a defined amount. That now requires a 45-day wait. Well, nothing is free, so what has happened, and we now see newspaper stories along these lines, what has happened is the general rate of interest has gone up. So all those people who have always paid on time are paying in part for this source of this new substantive rule. It becomes a little harder to get credit. Other kinds of charges increase. I mean, this is the nanny state, and responsible adults lose out. Now, I don't want to deny that many consumers have cognitive or educational limits and make poor choices. There are, it seems to me, two fundamental ways to respond: presets and mandatory terms. Consider pension investments for a moment. These days, most pension plans are defined contribution plans, which means that there is personal choice involved. You choose the investments, and that creates many sources of risk. You can pick the wrong investments, you can under-diversify, you can make a bad portfolio choice. The optimal portfolio changes with age, but as people age, they tend not to rebalance their portfolios. You can have all sorts of risk from short-sightedness, that is, people defer saving, even though if they could fully realize their life cycle earnings and savings, they would choose to save now. Now, employers can deal with many of these risks by presumptive allocations. Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein have shown that most people leave those presumptions alone and they gain from it. But it would be very bad, I think, to ban departures from those presumptions, because the presumptions depend on the median. And many people who aren't in the median of the distribution would lose if they couldn't change the preset. So presets, yes; substantive risk regulation, no. So here's my brief recap. Both principles of liberty and principles of economics support freedom of choice. Government can help by enforcing contracts, banning fraud, facilitating insurance, and sometimes by providing information and presumptive terms. But substantive prohibitions on terms and risks will just make us all worse off. Equal opportunity, yes; equal outcomes, no. It's very odd that the political factions that support personal liberty about religion and sexuality try to prevent economic transactions among consenting adults. Ronald Coase observed long ago that the same arguments that support free speech support free choice in a person's economic life. I think we should all support freedom and liberty across the board.
I'd like to start just by thanking the Federalist Society for inviting me to participate in this panel, and also to everyone in the room for caring enough about liberty to be here on a Saturday morning pretty early talking about it. I also want to celebrate, as Professor Bogus said, the Federalist Society's practice of including a range of perspectives in its events. It reminds me of a similar practice of economist and Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, with whom I'm lucky to get to teach a course every 3 years. Some of his co-teachers, like me, have similar political views to his, but he also famously co-taught at a class for many years with Robert Nozick, and I really respected that he did that, and I think it was great for the hundreds of Harvard undergraduates who got the chance to experience those diverse perspectives, and I think it's equally great that the Federalist Society takes that approach. Well, I'm sure that all of us agree that there are many things to love about America, but that probably the thing we love the most and celebrate the most is our ability to make the choices that suit us personally, even if they don't suit the average person. And I say all of us to emphasize, contrary to Frank's slight dig there at the end, that I actually think that the loving this form of liberty is really not associated more prominently with one political persuasion or the other. I think it's American, not conservative or liberal, Democratic or Republican, to cherish that kind of uniquely American approach to freedom and individualism. Here's a great example that's not political. It doesn't really directly involve either the social choices or the economic choices that Judge Easterbrook mentioned at the end. I learned about this many years ago because I'm married to a German, and it turns out that in Germany, there's a designated list of approved first names for your children. So if you'd like to name your child Easterbrook, because for your entire career since the first day of law school, you've deeply admired Judge Easterbrook's opinions and you want your firstborn to be named Easterbrook, and it's not on the German list, which it's not. You're out of luck. And what was just as surprising to me as this restriction on freedom was the fact that my husband, the European that he is, he thought it was great. He actually defended it. We had countless arguments over this over many years. Finally, I just dropped the topic because I realized I'm never going to get anywhere. But he would maintain over and over again that while, freedom to make your individual choices is important, adhering to social norms and structures and commonly accepted values is sometimes much more important. So to me, as I've revealed in the way I told the story, the German name approach is really at odds with the values that I hold most dear. If my religion or my beliefs about naming after a deceased relative or my deep admiration since the first year of law school of Frank Easterbrook lead me to want to have an unusual name for my child, I really want to live in a country where I can make that choice. I also think that to a significant degree, and this is why I asked to speak after Judge Easterbrook, because I am really pleasantly surprised by the amount of agreement between us, although there will be an important disagreement. I think to a significant degree, this love of liberty is even shared when it comes to economic choices across the American political spectrum. I think that most Americans, Democrat or Republican, conservative or liberal, understand the simple truth that different people want to choose differently when it comes to the risks that they'll take in their occupational choices, in their investment decisions, in their consumer purchases. Some people, probably not many in this room, but some people will consciously choose to become accountants or nurses, jobs with a very high degree of job security but lower pay than those people might earn if they had chosen a more risky occupation. I believe that even those Americans who make those less risky choices appreciate that it was their choice to choose a portfolio with lower risk and not a sort of European citizen package for everyone with lower risk and a more secure outcome. So all of that said, I think it's also true, and this will be the main point I want to emphasize and my fundamental point of departure from some of the other panelists. I think a bedrock aspect of valuing liberty for many Americans is or should be to continually assess in an empirical, rigorous, and serious way the accuracy of the factual understandings that underlie people's decisions. So let me offer a couple of simple examples. Judge Easterbrook mentioned credit cards, and of course, many of us probably receive credit card offers in the mail all the time. If you ever travel on Amtrak, which I do quite a bit, you'll actually be bombarded with multiple emails every day with the Amtrak MasterCard and all of the supposedly attractive things that you can get by getting a new Amtrak MasterCard. They obviously have not profiled me well because I get a lot of things about the Rockettes, which really is not a way to get me to subscribe to a MasterCard. I mean, nothing against the Rockettes, but it's not the particular form of cultural entertainment I'd be most likely to choose were I in New York City with a free evening. So for a person who currently has a large credit card balance, which probably is not descriptive of most people in this room, but is descriptive of many Americans, of course, one big question is transferring a balance to a new card, and as I'm sure all of you know, there's been a lot of debate over teaser rates that encourage people to transfer their balances. with the catch that over the longer term, the terms of the credit card may be much less advantageous. Now, from what I've said already, you'll already know that I definitely favor Americans having the freedom to choose to get the new card, pay off their balance quickly at the lower interest rate, and never encounter the negative features of the new card. I wouldn't want a merit regulation, as Judge Easterbrook called it, that banned this form of card entirely. It's the same as being able to choose your child's first name or the mix of security and upside you want in your job. But we do want to be sure and really, really work hard before we give up on this goal that people, when they're making those choices, are not relying on false predictions and beliefs in the exercise of their liberty. And I think at this point we have very strong empirical evidence from very rigorous studies done by leading economists of every political persuasion that people have extreme forms of misbelief, factual misbelief, about the likelihood that they'll pay off their credit card before they encounter these disadvantageous terms. Now let me give you a second example, since I've never kept a balance on a credit card, and I imagine many people in this room haven't either. Here's one that all of us can readily identify with. It's a longtime favorite example of Richard Thaler's, a prominent behavioral economist from the University of Chicago that was already mentioned, who was already mentioned by Judge Easterbrook. Here's Thaler's own description. Before the start of my class in managerial decision-making at the University of Chicago Business School, students fill out an anonymous survey on the course website. One of the questions is, in which decile do you expect to fall in the distribution of grades in this class? Students can check the top 10%, the second 10%, and so forth. Since these are Chicago MBA students, Thaler says, they are presumably well aware that in any distribution, half the population will be in the top 50% and half in the bottom. And only 10% of the class can actually be in the top 10% of the grade distribution. Nevertheless, the results of this survey reveal an enormous degree of unrealistic optimism about performance in the class. Typically, less than 5% of the class expects their performance to be below the median, or 50th percentile. More than half the class expects to perform in one of the top 2 deciles. And as soon as I heard this example many years ago, it really hit me, because I definitely knew which box I would be checking in that survey. So here's a population of very highly educated, sophisticated students, and they make a clear and large error in prediction. Now, to be clear, some of those students who check the top 10% are not making an error. Some of them really will be in the top 10%. But most of them, mathematically, will not be. So on average, the great majority of the students is making an error in a very predictable, clear direction, and it's not small. So as I mentioned, we have a lot of research, and I'd be happy to give more examples in the question period, documenting this form of kind of systematic, rosy-tinted glasses that most Americans, most of the time, bring to many of their decisions. Lots of evidence that if the true chance of something good happening to people is X, most people say their chance of happening to them is 3X, and they're wrong on average. If the true chance of something bad happening to them is Y, they'll typically think it's a quarter Y or a half Y when it comes to their own risk. They're wrong about their estimates, and I believe it's equally wrong for our country to stand by silently as people exercise their liberty on very fundamental and important choices without trying harder than we have done to improve people's factual estimates in these decisions. Now, to be clear, if we're just talking about sort of elite Chicago business school students being wrong about their grades, I'm not claiming that that's the biggest social problem ever to hit the screen. But obviously, we're not talking about that. We're talking about a lot of the other contexts, such as mortgages and credit cards and occupational choice, that have already been mentioned. The other big point I'd like to make is that a very large body of economics and statistical work in the last 5 to 10 years by behavioral economists takes the next step beyond emphasizing the biases that people may have and starts to teach us about the ways that we can reduce those factual mistakes. And I don't mean teach us in a kind of opinion column sloganeering way. I mean large-scale statistical studies conducted by top people, refereed in professional journals, published, and then rebutted or debated by other studies to really try to come to the truth of the matter. One of the most interesting findings to me of this body of research is that oftentimes presenting people with a specific profile of a negative outcome or an only okay outcome is a very good way to recalibrate their optimism bias and make them realize that could happen to them as well. So in the Chicago example, not that this has been done to my knowledge, and I was actually thinking I should try doing it in one of my classes, but in the Chicago example, the evidence from other contests would suggest that if with that survey, Thaler distributed 2 or 3 profiles of students from past years and their backgrounds and their qualifications, and then their actual performance in the class, that would sort of make me think, that person sounds like me, and that person came out right at the 50th percentile. Maybe I need to recalibrate my estimate a little bit. Let me give you a lovely real-world example, and this will be one of my last comments. This involves a person who I'm sure is a hero of sorts here. I guess a true hero for his effect on elections for many people in this room, and an anti-hero for all of his policies, Ralph Nader. You've probably heard of him. In agitating for pension reform back in the 1970s, he used a striking version of the strategy that behavioral economists have been studying in the last 5 years, this strategy of presenting people with a concrete account of a non-rosy outcome to make it real that it could happen to them. The problem Nader faced in trying to get pension reform when he saw a lot of abuses and companies pulling out their pensions at the last minute was that people he met and talked to said, oh, that would never happen to me. I'm a good worker. I'm not one of those erratic workers or disfavored workers. My employer, they know I'm a great worker, and they would never take away my pension. So what Nader did is wrote a book with Kate Blackwell, published in 1973, called You and Your Pension, and he profiled excellent workers who lost their pensions. Charlie Reed, he wrote, thought he was going to get a pension. He went to work when he was 21 as a coal miner for Jones and Laughlin Steel, and after 23 years in the mines, he was laid off. 13 years later, he applied for the pension he thought he had been earning during his 23 years in the mines. He found there wasn't one. Instead, there was a rule Reed hadn't known about. He had to have 20 years of service within the 30 years preceding his application for benefits. If you were inclined to say, it can't happen to me, said Nader, meet some of the additional people who found out it could. And then he goes on to profile additional good workers who encountered this kind of outcome. So what these profiles do is bring home to people that the risk could actually materialize for them. I'll give you one last example, a fascinating book on smoking by Frank Sloan et al., published by Harvard University Press, that showed people who had a friend or a relative who contracted smoking-related lung cancer were the only ones who accurately estimated their own personal risk of getting lung cancer themselves. There are lots of different ways to make people more accurate. Some of them don't involve government at all. Many of us have friends or relatives we can talk to and find out that they lost their pension, and therefore it might happen to us too. But I believe strongly that it's way too soon to give up on the ways that government can play a supporting role in, as Frank said, a good disclosure regime, and that will help people to understand the factual predicates of their decisions. And my last sentence is that judges, in particular, are an important part of this picture because they're not subject to the same lobbyists that apparently ruined RESPA and other statutes. So thanks for your attentiveness on this Saturday morning, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much for those terrific comments and observations by each of you. While I'm under a mandate to stop pretty much on time, so I would request that anyone who has questions, any in the audience who has questions, make your way, please, to the microphones now. While that's occurring, let me ask whether any of the panelists want to respond to comments made by their fellow panelists. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a brief comment. It's interesting that Thaler's study was among University of Chicago students. I think that at the Yale Law School, it's true that 90% of the students do end up in the top 10%. Yale just uses a grading system that masks the difference among the students. The tough question, and I agree with Christine Jolls, that there's a lot of inaccurate beliefs that in principle things could be done better, but these things are very hard to pin down. A lot of these beliefs come about because of rational ignorance. People have limited amount of time and they can't spend it studying all of these risks. So many kinds of regulation, many people realizing this choose other forms of regulation. Ralph Nader's book did not lead to better risk disclosures. It led, among other things, to ERISA. And ERISA made most pension plans vest after 5 years irrevocably, 10 originally, 5 now. And one of the consequences of that was the shift, which we are now seeing almost at its end, out of defined benefit plans where the employer is making all the investments and into defined contribution plans which vest immediately and are perfectly portable and never vanish, but impose on the retiree, impose on the employee and retiree all of the investment choices, which it may turn out they're completely unsuited to make. So one of the difficulties here is that a legal intervention designed to deal with one kind of problem may simply generate another.
I'd like to respond briefly to Judge Easterbrook. But first, a very quick tip to Professor Jolls. This is my Amtrak MasterCard. Get the damn card and the emails will stop. Judge Easterbrook gives me comfort that would sustain me for a long time because I also think that life is too short, and when confronted with long boilerplate contracts, even important ones like, I don't know, leases and stuff, I don't read them. And I always feel enormously guilty about it. But now I'm going to say if Judge Easterbrook doesn't read this stuff, then I'm going to feel a little less guilty. I agree with him 80% of the way, maybe even 90% of the way, that government ought to, in commercial transactions, largely be limited to enforcing contracts and worrying about fraud. But his absolutist position, I can't go the whole way with it, and it doesn't even have to do with how people view risk and just a simple aspect in terms of information and disclosure. So let's take like one of the first disclosure requirements, I think was gas stations. So we go to a gas station, they've got posted up in certain size lettering how much it's per gallon for, I don't know, 97 rating, 98 rating, whatever it is, and it has it at the pump. And government comes in, licenses and inspections, and makes sure that when it says you got 10 gallons, supposedly, it's supposed to be calibrated so you actually got 10 gallons. Well, I think that it does decrease freedom for the gas stations to have to post those things in a certain way, in a certain size. But I think that it does increase freedom for we consumers when we see the gas stations on two sides of the street and we make a choice. I happen to very much appreciate the food labeling. What's in that package of food, and certain information about calories, protein, etc. And I know that that decreases liberty for the food companies, but it increases my meaningful choice, ability to make choices, and my liberty. And I think that we need to not have an absolutist idea about these things, but recognize the trade-offs. Recognize the trade-offs. Almost all of the examples he gave of, mindless, numbskull regulations, of course, we all agree with that. We all agree with that. And anything that's all in capital letters, there's not enough Excedrin in the world to take care of it.
Thank you. On the right, please keep your questions brief. I'd like to get through just as many as we possibly can.
Hi, Josh House. I'm a student at George Washington. This question's for Professor Jolls, actually. You kind of provided your own counterexample, because it seems to me like kind of the lack of knowledge provided kind of an entrepreneurial opportunity for Nader to come in and write a book about it. And it seems like, I mean, you did mention that the private sector can solve these coordination problems through mechanisms like that. What would you say to somebody who said, every time the government steps in to solve a coordination problem, that's taking a job away from an entrepreneur who could have filled that problem on his own? For example, a gas station that could have come up with a better sign than anyone else's. People go, well, I appreciate the guy lets me know what I'm paying before I buy the stuff. So what would you say? I mean, it seems to me when the government fills that hole, that takes a job out of an entrepreneur's kind of playbook.
I think that's a great point, and it's a nice reminder to go back to Professor Bogus's observation earlier that we should look at the particular context. One advantage of looking at it from a sort of economics perspective with empirical studies is that we're studying the current world. And so we're studying the world with any entrepreneurs who may have emerged and made whatever solutions they are able to make. And if we study that current world in a large data set and we still find very large factual misestimates that people are making, we have pretty good evidence that the existing market and the existing pool of entrepreneurs haven't solved the problem. My own belief is that in most cases, entrepreneurs will have solved the problem, and then when we study it, we won't find those factual misestimates. But in an important set of remaining cases that are very meaningful and significant, it won't work out that way, and we should look to data to know which case we're looking at.
On the left, thank you.
Question for Professor Jolls also. I was wondering if you could say something about the problem of cognitive bias in individuals who are government decision makers, because cognitive bias and over-optimism are a problem that government decision makers face as well as private individuals. Federal Reserve Board may be overly optimistic that it can print money without causing inflation. Presidents may be overly optimistic that they can be friendly to dictators in other countries and that will produce better behavior. And so I guess the question is, if there is, I agree there's a problem of cognitive bias, but wouldn't it apply just as much to government as to private decision makers, and doesn't that suggest some limits on the cognitive bias argument as an argument for enhancing the role of government?
Well, once again, that's a brilliant question, but I think the answer is clear. Once again, there's no one-size-fits-all solution, and anyone who is peddling that, I think, should be immediately suspected. So one of the reasons in my work I focus a lot on optimism bias is that it's an what people call an egoistic bias. So the whole idea is, I think I'm better than average, and you are not going to think I'm better than average. That's almost the definition of the bias. So almost definitionally, a government actor wouldn't be optimistically biased about my grade in Thaler's class, even though he or she might be optimistically biased about his or her own grade in the class. So that in that context, that's my response, but I wholly agree with you that in many other contexts, there's every reason to think that the government bureaucrat would be just as behaviorally biased, and I think that point needs much more attention in the existing behavioral law and economics world.
My question is for our Burkean liberal, although I hope, Professor Jolls, if you have a second to know the answer about the German naming system, I would be interested to know if Adolf is still on the list.
I don't know.
Right. If it is, that may have been the reason for the system right there. Sir, number one, thank you very much for coming. Number two, don't have enough time here for a complete re-education campaign as to your concept of liberty, but just to explore for a second the idea that the doctors will make less, which you view as the only negative to the system you propose. You know, I think you would agree that those gifted people who are in medicine that are interested in earning a lot of money will simply find another place to go if they can't earn it in medicine in our disparate capitalist system. So we may have a different set of individuals in that system, and if their pay resembles at all the pay we see in other heavily regulated, similar nonprofit systems, government systems, teachers, and public sector unionized persons, not only are they not underpaid, they're very heavily overpaid in comparison to what they could make with similar skills in the economy. So I think you should set your mind at rest about that annoying negative that in this system they will be underpaid. And you may please comment.
A couple of things. Doctors today, our system today is a market-failed system anyway. We don't go to a doctor and negotiate a price with that doctor. We go to a doctor and the insurance company pays a sum, and one of the problems in the system is that there's a discontinuity, a detachment between those who are using the services and those who are paying for the services. But from the doctor's point of view, they are already being impressed into taking certain sums of money, and that doesn't, under the current system, that doesn't bother me because they're getting paid with public money, whether it's government money or private insurance money, they're getting paid basically with public money. The data do not support the view that if they get paid less, people will stop going to medical school and stop practicing medicine. Let me repeat what I told you. In France, there are more doctors per capita than there are in the United States. And with one exception, and it's an important exception, pediatricians, there's no waiting. And the doctors have made a trade-off. One other thing they get is they get free education. They get free medical education. So there's some trade-off there. They don't have paperwork. They're practicing medicine. And apparently they are, in France, happy with the choice. And the doctors in the other systems are happy with their choices, whereas the physicians, talk to your physician, the physicians in our system are under increasing pressure from private insurance, and their lives are miserable, and they're spending less time practicing medicine. And so I'm not suggesting that the fixed fees for physicians is not a reduction in liberty and not a problem. What I am suggesting is we've got a very large, complicated system, and we need to talk about how to maximize liberty for everybody. We've got to talk about that, and we have to talk about it without demagoguing it and without ideologizing it. We have to talk about it within specifics, and we have to be able to talk about it intelligently among ourselves. And in this audience gets that. So it's not a. Anyway, that's my response.
On the trade-off between equality and risk, I guess I'm interested in picking up a little bit on Boyden Grace's comments. The U.S. has, in general, historically, had has had somewhat more of a preference for risk, and a lot of things have been structured accordingly. Any reactions to the comments that often exist about, well, why aren't we more like Europe, or urging us to be more like Europe in terms of that trade-off? Do panelists have a reaction as to whether what kind of sacrifices should we appropriately accept on either side of that. What kind of inequality is it appropriate to accept, and what kind of risk is appropriate to let people take in the interest of freedom?
Well, let me take a stab at it. The country that intrigued me the most when I was in here was Denmark, because they seem to have found a way to bifurcate, to separate unemployment insurance and welfare from competitive markets for able-bodied men and women who were engaged in commerce. And they had a very nice safety net. People in the United States might say, well, gosh, if you have that much unemployment insurance, you will discourage some people from going to work and finding jobs. Maybe so. But on the other hand, the Danish economic system was as deregulated or more deregulated than the U.S. system, and people could rise and fall and make as much as they can make and lose as much as they could lose. I mean, that is, entrepreneurs could. And to me, that always seemed a very good model. It didn't characterize Europe generally, although maybe Europe may be moving that way. United States, of course, it's more freedom to fail in both the marketplace and in the welfare space. Less bifurcation. I don't know where the right mix is necessarily, except to say that on the one hand, we escaped the legacy of feudalism, and so social mobility and ability to improve oneself and move up has been met with much greater acceptance in the United States than still is the case in Europe. On the other hand, what I worry about here today is the amount of wealth that is being controlled by Wall Street, frankly, and how much of that is being encouraged, nurtured by the way our regulatory system is evolving. And, Wall Street used to have 15% of the GDP or 50% of the market cap. Now it's 25%. And what real things have been created with that increase in percentage? And I don't know what to do about that, except slim down government, because I think government is partly responsible for it. But I once asked a distinguished German writer who teaches part-time at Stanford, I won't identify his name specifically, I said, will free markets ever really be accepted in Europe? And he said no, because the Scottish Enlightenment took up over the British Isles, crossed the Atlantic, dumped 1,000 years of feudalism in the process, and set foot in your Constitution, and it has thrived ever since, but it never got across the channel in the other direction. But I sometimes worry now, and when I was in Brussels, I kept saying to my friends in the D.C. Circuit, I said this yesterday, Brussels is going to regulate us all, and there won't be any need for a D.C. Circuit, because the rules out of Brussels are going to control, and how wrong I was. I mean, look where we are now, and the judges on the D.C. Circuit now beam at me proudly and say, we're going to be judging for the rest of our lives, no problem. So I don't know how to, I think somehow in some ways Europe has gone to the right of us, which I can't pretend to have accomplished myself and when I was over there. That's somebody else who did that. But I don't know what the answer is, Gene, but I would, for anyone who wishes to look at the European experience, what the Germans have done to deregulate their labor markets has been partly responsible, mostly responsible for their current success, and also look at the Scandinavian countries. They seem to have found a way to keep the safety net without compromising the free market.
Was it to that side? I missed. I'm sorry.
My question is for anyone at the panel who'd care to comment on it. A child falls off a swing on a school playground, is injured in an unfortunate accident. The school district gets hit with a big verdict. Soon after that, all over the state, schools close their playgrounds or at least take the swings out. In my own hometown, I'm part of a group of business people trying to reopen a closed department store. Our biggest issue is how can we raise the money necessary without becoming SEC registrants? Because having to craft that disclosure statement with a lot of all caps pages that just Easterbrook won't read anyway is so expensive that a small business could not pay for it. Now, the people who impose these requirements are not evil people trying to take away liberties. They're well-intentioned people who want to address a problem resulting from a risk right in front of them, an injured child or a defrauded investor. But how do we make sure systemically that when these decisions are made, that the consequences for the rest of society, for the common good, are also taken into account, that we don't reach a short-sighted decision that has negative consequences for all the rest of us.
The myths about the tort system are gigantic. One of the last times I was at a Federalist Society meeting, the issue that came up was the tort system is driving diving boards into oblivion. And I studied that and wrote an article about it, and I think that that's not the case, and I think that the myths about playgrounds are largely myths as well. Playgrounds, by the way, are all about risk. It's all about teaching children risk. Climbing and falling, it's all about that. So I think in terms of liability on swings, what swings aren't disappearing. What has disappeared is the big, thick slab of wood that we all sat on and swang, and then we got off the swing, and that swing kept swinging, and that big club of wood clubbed some other little kid in the back of the head, which we thought was probably terrific at the time. But now there are, light, supple seats that you sit in, plastic, and maybe the tort system has done that. But the tort system is not driving playgrounds into oblivion.
Could I add something on this? The kind of problem you pose, and I don't want to talk particularly about torts, but when a decision is made collectively by the state, and of course judges are exercising the power of the state, it is just in the nature of that decision that people are making choices with somebody else's money. And the advantage of markets over collective decisions is that people are choosing with their own money and in light of their own goals. This also should influence the way we think about insurance. I'm very surprised that Professor Bogus proposed as an insurance scheme something that, to my mind, had almost nothing to do with insurance. Think for a second about housing. Housing's an even larger percentage of everyone's budget than medical care. But what does housing insurance look like? You don't get an insurance policy that entitles you to a house or an apartment. That would be fundamentally crazy. You buy a house with your own money and you get insurance against casualties like the house burning down or a tornado coming along and flattening it. That is, the insurance component is for extraordinary events that are not part of your normal budget. And if you wanted to think about dealing with medical care in a way that would increase the role of individual choice, you would limit medical insurance to, say, expenditures greater than 20% of the person's budget in a given year. Then people, when they shop for doctors, would shop for low-price, high-quality combinations because they're paying the normal amount for medical care out of their own pockets. And what was, to me, the most interesting feature of the debate of the last 2 years is that almost no one, maybe exactly no one in politics, suggested allowing people to make their own choices for the normal amount of medical care and limiting insurance to catastrophic losses.
Yeah.
Let me make a plea following on these last couple comments, and this is a very heartfelt plea. So smart people like the people in this room can argue till the cows come home about any of these issues as a matter of theory. Will the tort liability close down this lovely gentleman's playgrounds, or will, in the last 10 years with the increase in computing power and data and the beautiful fact that we have a federalist government, we have 50 states who do different things. And we don't have to sit here and argue all day because we can all make great arguments on both sides, and I won't even bother to try to, we can look to the data. And in the medical context in particular, wonderful work by, among others, Stanford Medical School professor Mark McClellan and Stanford Law School professor Daniel Kessler has been very influential in looking at differences across states in the liability regime under tort for malpractice and how that correlates to various patient outcomes. McClellan is a physician himself, so we don't have to worry that he doesn't understand what he's doing. We should do more of this work. Any of you who are interested should look at the National Bureau of Economic Research. We have a law and economics program, mostly apprised of people who do this kind of statistical work, and we can get data to supplement our theorizing.
Professor Jolls, I very much understand that you're focusing on the lack of information, not necessarily through fraud, but the misapprehension people may have about risk when they make these decisions. But I wonder if your research, depending upon its stretch on any given issue, is it actually capturing a signal or is it capturing noise? I mean, even somebody very seriously considering their risks in the housing markets 5 years ago and looking for any possibility of assessing how they individually might fare compared to others, would have been looking at the wrong question. And so I'm really concerned, much like the guy who's published lately about how silly it is that people drive across town to save a nickel on gas, but they don't take their opportunity cost into account. But the reality is he's really kind of bucking for regulating them to save them their opportunity, have the government save their opportunity cost for them. And I'm very concerned that the kind of narrowness of some of these ideas that you've put forward very adequately still might lead us in that direction.
Yes, let me just respond very briefly. 2 points. First of all, in many contexts are very complicated, and people don't even know the average risk, never mind their own bias, and we need to attend to that problem as well. Second of all, in your example, I wasn't familiar with the 5-cent guy, but that's a lovely example of, it sounds like he's pushing for merit regulation, but better to have him on his blog or in various places try through entrepreneurs, as was mentioned earlier, to get his message out that it might be stupid or waste money to drive. We don't need to ban it to recognize that people may be making the mistake.
My name is Jay Schweikert. I'm a student at Harvard Law School. I have a sort of follow-up question for Professor Jolls, responding about the previous points where she stressed that the need not to be absolutist, and that though the government might while private actors might normally be best able to handle these kinds of decisions, that's not every case, and so the government sometimes needs to get involved. And phrases such, that sounds very reasonable. But isn't the argument for absolutism a structural one? That while yes, we could identify, maybe we could talk about a few points where maybe there is an endemic problem in the private market, and maybe it would be good to have the government change things up. The way I read Judge Easterbrook's comments and other public choice scholars is to say, though that may be the case, we can't count on the structure of the government to ever limit itself to those particular settings, even if we agree that they exist. And so we have to just sort of bear the cost of not fixing those, because there's no way to ensure that we just fix those. So do you agree with that criticism? And if you, I guess relatedly, do you think that what are the ways that you think you could limit the structure of government so that it wouldn't overextend, as I think is a factual, practical matter, it almost always has across time and space throughout all of history?
It's obviously a profound question, and I can't answer fully, but I will try very briefly to say a couple of important things. One is, I'm just more hopeful than you are, and that's probably not something that we can settle in this.
But maybe it's a bias.
I was going to try to make a joke about that myself as you were speaking, and I decided it would fail. Perhaps that itself was a bias. I am more hopeful, and I'll tell you something that I think is interesting, and a nice note to leave you with. Richard Thaler, who's been mentioned several times, works very closely with not the Obama administration. I mean, he may work a little bit with the Obama administration. You know who he really works with? Prime Minister Cameron in Britain. And there's a whole behavioral advisory committee, and they are very plugged in at a very high level. And so I don't know if that gives you, that might make you feel worse or better, but that the conservative government in Britain has some sense that maybe it could use these kinds of tools that I've been talking about in a way that's consistent with that philosophy. I know that's not an adequate response, I'm sorry.
My apologies to those of you who are still in the line. I just got the signal from the powers that be that we have to bring this session to a close. But thank you from the audience. Thank you, panelists. And we appreciate everyone's attention and cooperation.